if we're going to be consistent, we have to say that if the Kurds want to secede, they should be able to. And if the Catalonians want to secede, they should be able to.
Hey everyone, this is Byron with Springtime of Nations. Today, I'm graciously joined by Professor Walter Block. He teaches at Loyola University in economics. He's also a senior fellow at the Ludwig Von Mises Institute. He's also the author of more than 24 books on various topics related to libertarianism, most famously the series Defending The Undefendable, as well as his books on the privatization of everything from roads and highways down to the water system. But today, what we're going to be mostly discussing, if that's all right with you, Walter, is the concept of secession, and particularly how libertarians should view that idea. So, Walter, you wrote an article about this back in 2007, is that right?
I forget. I wrote a lot. I don't remember what I wrote and when. I could maybe look it up, but that's plausible.
Okay. Well, I guess you'll have to take my word for it. I know you're a very prolific writer. But so essentially, the argument was both, first of all, secession as in a logical extension of free association and a logical extension of ultimately individual property rights and ultimately self-ownership. And then I think you looked at applying that to certain case studies, particularly the American Civil War. And then you sort of got into defining the American Civil War in terms of the nomenclature. And you notably argued that civil war is really a misnomer.
Absolutely, yes. I agree with your summary, very accurate. I see libertarianism as really predicated on three things. One is the non-aggression principle, keep your mitts to yourself, don't grab other people against their will or their property. Secondly is property rights, because if I grab something that you now have I stolen it from you or not, depends upon who is the rightful owner. And if you stole it from me yesterday, I'm just repossessing it.
Right, absolutely.
And the third one is free association. Nobody should be compelled to associate with anyone else, which is now most relevant to the so-called Civil War. It really wasn't a civil war, because a civil war means, the way I understand it, is two sides, each wanting to run the whole country. Now, there was a Spanish Civil War in 1936 because the commies and the fascists each wanted to run Spain. And there was a civil war in Russia between the white and the red armies in 1917. Each wanted to run the whole place. But in 1861, there was no civil war. The North wanted to run the North and the South, but the South didn't want to run the North. The South just wanted to secede. And I think secession is a part of libertarianism. You should always be allowed to secede. I mean, the whole problem with rape is that the rape victim wants to secede from the rapist, doesn't want to associate with him. And the rapist insists upon associating with her. Or I don't know, murder.
Right.
The victim doesn't want to associate with the murderer, and the murderer wants to associate with the victim and kill the victim. So yes, secession is a very important thing. Now, a lot of people will say, well, this was just to preserve slavery. No. It's got nothing to do with slavery. Look, if California wants to secede right now, California doesn't have any slaves, as far as I know. Well, all the taxpayers, but don't bother me with that. Or if Louisiana wants to secede from the U.S., that got nothing to do with slavery. And as my friend Tom DiLorenzo has written several books on this issue, the North had slavery too. And
right.
Lincoln's very famous statement was, "I want to preserve the Union." That's my shtick. I'm putting words in his mouth. He never said that, but that was his thing. And if keeping slavery will preserve the Union, I'll keep slavery. And if getting rid of slavery will better preserve the Union, I'll get rid of slavery. Namely, I don't give a rat's rear end about slavery. I care about, keeping the Union together, which, is hardly a libertarian thing, because that denies free association. You can't get a divorce. look, let's say my wife is unhappy with me, she should be able to get a divorce. If I say, no, no, you can't have a divorce, well, I'm violating her rights of secession, or her rights of association. So anyone should be able to get a divorce from anyone. And if Louisiana secedes from the United States, well, then um, New Orleans should be able to secede from Louisiana.
Right. And
And
you would carry that all the way down to the level of individuals, right?
right, right. I live in the Garden District. The Garden District should be able to secede from New Orleans, and my block should be able to secede from the Garden District, and I should be able to secede from everyone else on my block. I'm
And
an anarchist. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think you brought up in the essay too that even a slave should be able to secede from a slave owner, and that's really what being free of slavery means.
Yeah. Well, except for voluntary slavery. I mean, if you have
Right.
voluntary slavery, then like, God forbid my son has a horrible disease and it costs 20 million to cure him, and I don't have 20 million, and you're a very rich guy and you be happy to have me on your plantation picking cotton and giving you economics lessons, and you could kill me or whip me. And we both gain, because I value his life more than my freedom, and you value my servitude more than the 20 million. So as in all voluntary exchanges, there's mutual benefit in the ex ante sense. But apart from that, yes, slavery, the slave should be able to secede, run away, because he was captured, and that's a despicable system.
So I'm glad that you brought up the idea of voluntary slavery, because that's a very unique contribution that I think you've made to libertarianism, is sort of fleshing out that idea. I want to ask, for clarification's sake, how would you say that that stacks up to something that has historically existed, like indentured servitude?
Well, the indentured servitude is very different. First of all, it was only for 7 years. And secondly, you couldn't whip an indentured servant. And you certainly couldn't kill one. I mean, if you did, you'd be guilty of murder or assault and battery. So it's very different. It's just a long-term contract. Look, the NBA just signed some great young basketball player, signed him for 7 years, say. Well, he's an indentured servant, namely, he's got to play basketball for the team.
Right.
I mean, and well, basketball is a little different because he can now quit under certain circumstances, but
and that's all established in the contract, right?
Right. But if the contract says, look, you got to stick with the New York Knicks or the New Orleans Pelicans, you got to stick with us for 7 years. Well, that's like an indentured servitude. Namely, he's got to listen to what the coach says, and he's got to play basketball and all that. But that's not slavery. That's very, very far removed from slavery.
Right. Okay, great. And then if I could bring it back to secession for a second. So one very popular objection that people bring up to slavery is they say, well, it's good that if in theory we could secede all the way down to the level of individuals and everyone should have the right to secede. But from a libertarian perspective, perhaps if one state secedes from another, and then the new state is very unlibertarian in its policies, more so than the two would be together, and the other one doesn't get much better as a result of being free, then perhaps you could make an argument from a libertarian perspective that a libertarian should oppose that secession. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're making a very powerful point, that you have two states, A and B, or North and South of the United States, or whatever, and together they're 50% on the libertarian meter.
Mm-hmm.
And when they secede, state A will be 5 on the libertarian meter, where 100 is freedom, very bad, and B will be 35. Namely, they both could have been 50, and now one of them is 5 and the other is 35. So we've had a diminution in liberty. Well, I mean, you could still, they would have a right to do it, but in this case, it would turn out badly. Well, look, my wife wants to divorce me. Let's say I'm unhappy. I don't want her to, but let's suppose she did. She has a right to do it, even though, let's say, arguendo, she would be less happy and I would be less happy. So the divorce would not be, what's the word, utilitarian. It would not be pragmatic. It would be a loss of freedom and happiness or whatever, but it would be a part and parcel of freedom.
Right.
I shouldn't have said there would be a loss in freedom. It would be a loss in utility. It would be a loss in happiness.
if I can play devil's advocate for a second here. So, as libertarians, we ultimately believe, though, that all rights are ultimately individual rights unless there's, a voluntary agreement between groups, right?
Yeah.
So, given that, couldn't there be a case where there actually is less freedom? Because suppose that state B secedes from state A, and then in turn, state B forbids anyone from seceding from state B, and state B is less libertarian than it would have been, so that if it had stayed with, therefore, individual rights are more violated because of the secession.
You're making a very powerful point, and I see the power of your point. It's a very good point, but I would try to have our cake and eat it. I
Mhm.
would try to say what's going on is state B, the bad guys, B for bad. They're the ones that go down to 5% of liberty. Well, they had a right to secede, but they had no right to prohibit anyone else from seceding.
Right.
So there were two separate acts, and we as libertarians can distinguish between the two acts. I mean, that would be a way to have our cake and eat it, right?
Okay.
And that way we could say, yes, people always have a right to secede. But look, suppose my wife divorces me, and as a result, I start murdering people, or I start raping people, or whatever evil I do. And right now, I'm not murdering or raping anyone. But if she divorces, and she'll also start robbing people, right? We're both going to be sons of bitches divorced. Whereas right now, we're normal people, we're not criminals. Well, does she have a right to divorce me? Yes. Do I have a right to rape and murder? No.
No.
Does she have a right to steal? No. So we can sort of bifurcate the thing as a way of saving the right to secede. And by the way, if it came down to the individual level, even though I'm an anarchist, I favor 7 billion governments. Namely, we each have one.
Right.
So if you want to ask a girl out for a date, you just can't ask her out for a date. You have to get your foreign minister to ask her foreign minister if she's going to go on a date with you. So it'd be a little silly. Well, I don't think it would be silly. I think sovereignty should be for every individual. On the other hand, most libertarians are not anarchists. I would say 2 to 5% are anarchists. Most of them are limited government libertarians or constitutionalists or classical liberals or people like that. So the position that I'm articulating is a minor position among libertarians.
Absolutely. So, it's funny that you should bring up, because at the time that you wrote this, I believe this wasn't quite as popular, but I think there was a few years ago a movie about what was it? I don't know if this is even true or not, but the Free State of Jones, where there was some free state that tried to secede from the Confederacy. So you would support something like that too, right?
Well, yes. I mean, we go down to the individual level, and
Right.
I go no further than the individual level. My right arm can't secede from my body, uh, although my hair seceded from my head. But that's a different issue.
Okay, awesome. And then, speaking of secession in general, in terms of the sort of on the ground facts, it does seem like secession has really picked up steam since the time that you wrote about this. I mean, obviously, we had things like in Catalonia, in Scotland, something that the Springtime of Nations channel has tried to cover events like that, where basically in Europe and really around the world, there's a variety of different secessionist movements. I know you said that in the 2014 referendum, you were very much behind the Scottish wanting to secede. I think new polling has shown that most of them want to now, literally a majority, whereas before I think it was 45%.
Well, there are many, many cases. Brexit is another example.
Right?
Britain seceded from the European community, and Taiwan wants to stay seceded from China, and
Absolutely.
China doesn't want. See, right now, I would say Taiwan has succeeded in secession, and China is trying to undo it. And the U.S. the U.S. is sort of a hypocritical situation here, because on the one hand, we did not allow the South to secede. We fought a war to make the South stay, and yet we're trying to defend Taiwan's right to secede from China, or to stay seceded from them. So the U.S. Central government, Washington D.C. is playing an inconsistent, hypocritical role. Now, the test case would be: suppose Louisiana wanted to secede from the U.S. What would Washington D.C. say about them apples? Now, if they would say, okay, leave, we'll be buddies. Let's have free trade between Louisiana and the U.S. and we'll be buddies. Well, then that would be okay. But if they said, over my dead body, you're seceding. If you try to secede, we're going to nuke you. Well, then their position with regard to Taiwan is a little bit undermined, because on the one hand, they're saying anyone can secede from China, but no one should secede from the U.S. So what's the difference?
And then, of course, ultimately, historically, the U.S. itself was a product of the secessionist movement in the War of 1776.
Yes, the evil U.S. seceded from Great Britain. I don't mean evil. I think the U.S. is perfect. The colonies were perfectly justified. But it's a hypocritical thing, the so-called Civil War, where a bunch of secessionists say that other people can't secede from them.
And it's somewhat ironic too, because the British Empire was much harsher on the slave trade and ultimately on slavery itself than the United States was. So if people would argue that, we can't have allowed the Confederacy to secede because they were more friendly to slavery. Remember, the Union wasn't totally, as you pointed out, unfriendly to slavery either. They had slave states. But then in the War of 1776, you had a more friendly to slavery power, the United States, seceding from a less friendly to slavery power, the British Empire.
Wait, are you saying, I'm not following you. Are you saying the British Empire was more or less friendly to slavery than the colonists?
The British Empire banned the slave trade, right, and were more active against slavery than the United States early on. Eventually, obviously, the U.S. would get on that page. But that's what's kind of strange about the arguments against secession is people will say, we can't let the Confederacy secede because slavery, but then couldn't the British say the same thing about the colonies?
Brilliant point. I certainly agree with that. And this is sort of what the 1619 people are saying. The New York Times, 1619, the country really started in 1619, and the Revolutionary War was really pro-slavery. And you've got a point. Not that it was purposely pro-slavery. I don't even think they thought about that.
It was just incidental to the time.
Incidentally, yeah. It just so happened, happenstance that the more slave-ish country was seceding, namely the colonies were more slave-ish, more supportive of slavery than the British.
And I believe, there was also movements earlier on in American history from radicals in the northern states, particularly New England, who were extremely anti-slavery, who wanted to secede from the U.S. because they didn't want to be associated with a body politic that was so in favor of slavery. And of course, that's justified as well.
Yes, Massachusetts in, I think, 1823, somewhere in there, wanted to secede on the ground that the U.S. had slavery, and they were against slavery. These people were abolitionists. God bless them. And they were absolutely right to want to secede. So I think we pointed over and over and over again that secession has got nothing to do with slavery. It's two totally different issues. I mean, you might as well talk about chess. Well, maybe they played chess more among this secession than the other guy. It might be, but chess has got nothing to do with secession. Slavery has got nothing to do with secession. I mean, Catalonia wants to secede. They're not going to have slaves, and Spain doesn't have slaves. It's just totally two different issues, and it's just conflated.
Right, and I think that's something. Although secession doesn't have much to do with slavery inherently, it does have some inherent thing to do with freedom, because, not only, as you talked about, is there the right of free association, which ultimately brings secession down to the individual, but also, as a matter of fact, empirically, the way that statism tends to function is it tends to push towards greater and greater multinational, larger and larger institutions of power, right? With the UN taking over a lot of the US's role. Would you agree with that, or I sense some hesitation?
It's an empirical issue, and I'm not sure. There might be some slight tendencies in that direction, but if you look back every decade from 2020 to 2010 to 2000 and 1990, 1980, and ask, well, how many countries were there? according to your thesis here, there'd be fewer and fewer countries. But there might even be more countries now. I think a few new ones came into being. I'm not sure about that.
Right. Well, so what I would say is that there might be more new countries, but you also have more things like the European Union, obviously the United Nations having more and more power. So although there are more countries on paper, in terms of where the power lies, it does seem like that's becoming more centralized. Or at least I should say, if it's becoming less centralized in some instances, that is something, that's a reaction against the, tendency of statism.
It's interesting. I might want to quarrel with you whether the UN has got more or less power now. I mean, a case could be made that they have less power. But this leads me to another issue, namely within the United States, are we libertarians supposed to be centralists or decentralists? Namely, should we favor the federal government or the state government, or should we favor the state government vis-a-vis the county government? And a lot of libertarians, I think, make an error and say we should always favor decentralization. No, my view is we should favor libertarianism. And if the state, the government, the central government is more libertarian on a certain issue, well, then we should favor centralization. On the other hand, if the state government or the county government is more libertarian, then we should favor it. It really depends upon the issue. For example, Ronald Reagan wanted to kick New York City in the butt over rent control, because he said rent control is no good and New York City has rent control. Therefore, we're going to, cut you off from these funds or those funds or whatever it was. And I said, hey, my PhD dissertation was on rent control, so I have an interest in rent control, and rent control is a violation of rights. It's theft from landlord property. And I favored the federal government kicking the butt of the mayor of New York City. On the other hand, Oregon just passed the legalization for not marijuana, but cocaine and heroin, I think. And now I favor the state of Oregon vis-a-vis the federal, because the federal is against that. So go ahead.
I was going to say that brings up sort of an interesting point then. I would like to ask, how does that square with what you said earlier about even if a state B, suppose, secedes and favors worse things? Because that seems like those are almost opposite. How would you reconcile those?
I hate you. You keep trying to come up with good criticisms of my theory. How dare you? I'm getting off. No, I'm kidding. There are people who would say, well, this reminds me of a story. Notice how I'm ducking out of this. A buddy of mine was interviewing Nancy Pelosi over the minimum wage. And he said, well, do you have interns? And she said, yes. And he said, well, that's hypocritical. And you know what she said? I'm going to call the cops on you. Seriously, I mean, it's the most amazing thing.
Oh,
so
please
I'm
don't call the cops on me.
I'm calling the cops on you. Sorry, too bad. Okay, now let's get back to the thing. When I'm rooting for Ronald Reagan vis-a-vis the mayor of New York City, then I forget who it was, who had rent control, right? What I'm saying is that liberty would be increased if we favored the federal government kicking the butt of New York City, because New York City was in the wrong. And in the other case, in Oregon, in the drugs, it would be the opposite way. And we should favor liberty. But again, my answer to your previous criticism of my view is you have to break it into two stages, two separate stages. One, does my wife have a right to divorce me? Yes. Two, now she becomes a criminal and I become a criminal. Well, does that mean she doesn't have a right to divorce me? No, she has a right to divorce me, and it's bad to be criminals. So I think I can use the same argument here as I used before.
Okay.
Namely, there is no logical inconsistency with the position that we should favor liberty, and in the case of rent control, or in the case of country A and B, where B is a real bad country. And also we should favor secession. And we should try to have our cake and eat it, so to speak. We should try to cleave to both, and we shouldn't allow critics of libertarianism. And I know you can be a critic of libertarianism. Okay, nothing wrong with that.
I'm a libertarian myself.
Oh, I know you are, but and you're doing it. What did you call it? As oh, what's the word you used? I'm missing a word here. You did it not as a
Devil's advocate, I think.
devil's advocate. That's the word I'm looking for. But look, it's possible that libertarianism isn't perfect. I mean, I'm a libertarian, but I'm open to criticism of libertarianism. But my natural instinct is when somebody comes up as a devil's advocate, my natural instinct is to try to defend libertarianism. But if I can't, I'll admit, okay, so libertarianism is wrong on some issue. I mean, I'm not a religious, fanatical libertarian in that sense. That if someone can show me some flaw, well, I'll change my mind, right? But I don't think you as devil's advocate or a libertarian critic has really confounded us yet on this issue.
Right, absolutely. So I think you bring up sort of a good point on how to break that or strike that balance between there's nothing inconsistent about saying that on an object level issue, we might root for a larger power while also recognizing the right of secession. And I would say, sort of the way that I personally try to square that circle is basically this, that although there may be cases where certain secessionist movements result in a net decrease of individual rights, that in general, the larger trend towards the breakup of big powers is going to be and this is an empirical assertion, as you noted earlier, but is going to probably be more friendly towards individual rights across the globe. Because I think Mises talked about this too, right? There's always a chance you can have sort of countries competing against each other. And I mean, this is something even statists talk about, where they'll say there's a race to the bottom with regard to the minimum wage, where some states will want to lower their minimum wage, and then others to compete will lower theirs, right? And I think that race to the bottom works in favor of individual rights ultimately.
Yeah, Lou Rockwell once said his ideal, apart from 7 billion countries, would be 5,000 countries, each one with about 10,000 people or something like that, sort of a city-state. And that would be a movement in the right direction. Now, as for New York City rent control and all should have been able to secede from the US, and then the landlord should have been able to secede from New York City. So again, we can have our cake and eat it. We don't have to admit that secession leads to or is the same thing, or there's a contradiction between secession and liberty.
Absolutely. So then I guess what I'd ask you is, how do you see the relationship, and this is sort of a controversial topic in libertarianism, between libertarianism, or even more specifically anarchism, and nationalism? Because I know that there are some, well, historically, there have been many times where that thread has been threaded, right? Even in the modern day. Earlier on this channel, we talked about Kurdistan, right? And they're very more left-wing anarchist, although there's reasons for libertarians to be sympathetic, both in the sense that they're secessionists, but they are ideologically, many of them, anarchists, and yet they also square that with a kind of Kurdish nationalism. So how would you say that those two relate?
Well, you're raising some very, very good, important points. A lot of times what happens is, you have to distinguish between left-wing anarchism and libertarian anarchism. Because it's Kropotkin and all those guys that favored anarchism, but they were a bunch of commies.
Right.
So I'd much rather be with a limited government libertarian than with a commie anarchist who wants to ban money and ban trade and all sorts of crazy things like that. What's his name? The famous anti-war lefty. He's about 85 years old now.
Noam Chomsky.
Noam Chomsky. He would be like that. I mean, he's an anarchist, but
Well, I would say that Noam Chomsky is quite a bit more extreme than even historical, what we think of as left-wing anarchists. I mean, Kropotkin was especially bad, but if you go back to someone like Proudhon, who is accepted as an anarchist by a lot of the left-wing anarchists, he is someone who I would say is he considered himself on the same side with Bastiat. He disagreed with a lot of the communists. A lot of the communist anarchists later on attacked him, and then his successor Benjamin Tucker was great friends with Lysander Spooner, even though they were left-wing anarchists.
Yeah, you're making a good point. I mean, Tucker and Murray Rothbard liked Tucker and some of these other guys. The problem with Proudhon is he said property is theft, but
Right.
if you can't have theft unless you have property.
Yeah,
'Cause,
yeah.
so
And,
Proudhon.
no one would ever accuse Proudhon of being a very clear writer either. I think that was something he took criticism for. It's not quite clear to a lot of people like what exactly he meant by that. There's always debate, and I think that's sort of what allows him to run that gauntlet of both being accepted by the left-wing anarchists while at the same time having some heritage in the lineage of anarcho-capitalists even.
A friend of mine who lives in Hong Kong, uh, he says that the people who are protesting against mainland China
Mm-hmm.
are a bunch of commies. And the communists, the mainstream now a little bit, they're a little weak on the Uyghurs and they're a little weak on this and that and the other. But according to this guy who I trust, he's a co-author of mine, a Chinese guy, he says that, when the Hong Kongers are fighting the mainland Chinese, it's the mainland Chinese who are more free. This reminds me of this movie, The Mouse That Roared. Did you ever hear of The Mouse That Roared, a movie?
I haven't.
A wonderful movie. Peter Sellers plays all the roles, about 5 roles. What happened is there's this little country like Liechtenstein or Monaco, and this is at the end of World War II, and the U.S. is giving money to all the countries in Europe that had conquered, and so this mouse that roared, Liechtenstein kind of country, writes to the United States, says, "Hey, how about giving us some money?" And the U.S. ignores them. So then they got this bright idea: let's declare war against the United States, and we'll lose, and then then they'll give us money like they're giving money to France or Germany or Italy or whatever. So what happens is Peter Sellers comes over with first they send a letter: we declare war against you, and you see some guy in the State Department, he just sort of throws it away. So Peter Sellers and about 10 guys in these funny looking military uniforms, they come over to the United States and they conquer the U.S. Don't ask. So anyway, there's a wonderful discussion between Peter Sellers, the general of the army, and Peter Sellers, the woman who is the prime minister, and she's saying, "You idiot! You were supposed to lose the war. You won the war. You moron." Well, Hong Kong for a long while was the mouse that roared.
So,
I mean, when the British left Hong Kong, yeah, when the British left Hong Kong, the Chinese were a bunch of commies, economically speaking, and Hong Kong was very free market. And guess what happened? Hong Kong won. Hong Kong won the war. Namely, China became way more free enterprise than it ever was.
right.
And one of the reasons that China has a splendid economy compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago under Mao, when the Cultural Revolution, it was just millions of people killed, is because the mouse that roared. Hong Kong beat China, just like the Liechtenstein beat the United States. But nowadays, according to this friend of mine, who I trust very, very much, he's saying that the Hong Kong people are worse than the Chinese. And getting back to your thing about Kurdistan, well, they might be anarchists, but they're not our kind of anarchists. We don't want them living in our neighborhood, our political, economic neighborhood.
Right. So if I can push back on that for just a second, I would say that although the Kurdish do have a lot of left-wing ideas, I also think that there is some gulf, as there often is in a lot of these kind of messy situations, particularly in third world, between what their stated ideology might be and how it actually works on the ground. Right. I mean, just as an earlier example of this, you had someone like Jonas Savimbi, right, who was originally a Maoist, but then wound up with the support of the United States fighting communism. I think that can tend to be very fluid, and I would say that although I'm by no means an expert on the situation in Kurdistan, I would say that they probably are more libertarian than the Syrian government, certainly, and definitely more libertarian in our kind of libertarianism, not Kropotkin, than most states in the region and even many states in the West.
Well, I would favor a country called Kurdistan, and it would be part of Syria and part of Turkey. And the Turkish people aren't going to like this much, but if we're going to be consistent, we have to say that if the Kurds want to secede, they should be able to, and if the Catalonians want to secede, they should be able to.
Right.
And whether
the Hong Kong as well, right?
Hong Kong should certainly be able to secede, even if my friend is right, and the Hong Kongers are worse than the mainland Chinese. They should still be able to secede, and then my friend should be able to secede from them. Just like New York City with its rent control should be allowed to secede, and then the landlord should be able to allow to secede from New York City.
Right.
Look, I promised you a half hour.
Yep.
This has been a delight, and please invite me on your show again, because you really asked good questions and we had a great conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Block. I really appreciate you coming on. And this is Byron with Springtime of Nations. Thanks so much, and I'll see you all next time.
You take care of yourself.
You too.
Thanks for watching Springtime of Nations, your source for libertarian and pan-secessionist commentary and analysis. We'll be back next week with more content. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. See you next time.